Welcome to a new episode at the bar, the social distancing episode, along with my buddies Gerardo Del Real and Nick Hodge from the Outsider Club / Resource Stock Digest. So, gents, we usually start this program with a toast, and we all have drinks in hand. So, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my tequila and Las Rocas con limon, and I'm going to add some St. Patty's Day
Look at
coloring.
that.
So,
Look at that.
salute, gentlemen.
Salud,
Cheers.
caballeros. Cheers.
And the toast for today is, and I'm not entirely responsible for this, it was originally Kirsty's idea, but I expounded on that, and it's the first commandment of social distancing. Thou shalt not COVID thy neighbor's 19 germs.
Cheers, Mickey.
So, gentlemen, I'm going to jump in. Neither of us are delicate flowers. I think we're always pretty frank and blunt with each other. And I know that a month or so ago there was a back and forth between Mickey and Mr. Hodge here, and I thought it's relevant to our conversation because of how things have developed and how it kind of coincides with some of how we thought about COVID-19 when this first was announced and we were starting to get reports, and how it's developed since then. For those not familiar, a bit of context, Mr. Nick Hodge had a presentation at PDAC out of concern for his loved ones and babies at home and his wife and himself. He decided last minute that it wasn't prudent to travel. This is before we had, the major outbreaks around the world. There were starting to be rumors out of China, and Mr. Fulp chimed in on Twitter, of course, and said, what was the tweet? I believe the exact tweet was something along the lines of three paranoid newsletter writers canceled their presentations at PDAC. Shameful. And I believe Mr. Hodge's response was, some of us have loved ones to look after. And so, again, I bring it up because I think it speaks to what we thought we had then and what this has morphed into now. And I know, Mickey, you have some pretty strong views on the civil liberties aspect of this, and I want to get those. But first off, gentlemen, anything you want to say to clear the air while we have each other here with drink in hand?
Well, my only point was it happened at the last minute, and in my opinion, at the time, it left a good friend of mine who sponsors that in a bit of a bind. So that's where I was coming from. I will also say, in regards to your timing, and I think that's a really good point, of the 23,144 attendees at the conference, there is one documented case of what I prefer to call the Wuhan flu. Now, that said, once Nick, I had not considered the reasons that Nick pointed out in his response to my tweet. So,
Well, yeah, that's just it. I was in Washington, and so just having my ear to the railroad tracks, knew that this thing was spreading like wildfire, right? And didn't know what the ramifications were going to be. I know you're going to talk about that a bit, Mickey, but I wasn't worried about myself getting sick per se. I was worried about them shutting it down, right? Which they're talking about doing now. Ain't no way I was sacrificing getting stuck in Toronto away from my family for a 20-minute speech at some mining conference. Ain't no way, Jack.
Fair point.
In retrospect, I appreciate it. So we've kissed and made up now. So
I like it. Let's talk where we're at now, gentlemen. The Dow is off some 30-something%. It's trading like a junior. We have a European banking crisis that I believe is on the verge of really escalating here soon. I think that's why you're seeing the dislocations in the treasury market. We have now what looks like to be maybe $4 trillion in stimulus that is going to be thrown at the wall in hopes that it sticks, right? And so a lot to talk about there. But before we get to that, Mickey, because you're gracious enough to host this today, I want to ask you, what kind of repercussions do you feel this will have in the context of government using a crisis. There's that old Bill Clinton saying, right? Rahm Emanuel said it, never let a good crisis go to waste. And we saw what happened after 9/11. We saw the amount of privacy violations and civil liberties that were just done away with. What is your biggest fear, speaking from that perspective?
Well, euphemistically, let's look at what they've talked about. We have social distancing, we have shelter in place, which I actually, until yesterday, thought was what snowflakes did when they found a safe space in their parents' basement. But um, we've got things, we've got curfews, we've got containment zones now, we have checkpoints, and we have so-called lockdowns. And my question then becomes, how far are we from declaration of martial law, where we lose all of our individual rights and freedoms to congregate, to move at times we want to, when we want to. There's curfews. It's this whole mishmash. And so I'm concerned by that because, as we know, in the global economic crisis, these things that were supposed to be temporary are now part of the American way, the American psyche. Whoever knew that the TSA would be this million-person bureaucracy or whatever it's evolved in, and we're all affected by that. Some of the people I talk to think that this is a social science experiment on the media and the government's ability to control the hoi polloi, if you will. So I'm very concerned about that aspect of it. And that doesn't even touch on the whole financial ramifications of what's coming.
Nick, any thoughts there? Mickey mentioned the TSA, Homeland Security, Department of Homeland Security was meant to be temporary. It became permanent. Warrantless searches, that became permanent. We've seen the militarization of our police forces around the country and frankly around the world since then. Any thoughts on that aspect of it before we touch on the human aspect and some of the intricacies there?
Well, there was more than that. I mean, there was the mass spying, the Edward Snowden stuff, the Patriot Act, the militarization of police. There was all kind of stuff that stemmed from 9/11. And I'll tell you, I was having a meeting with my staff the other day. I think, Gerardo, I might have told you this. And, we were just discussing world events. And I was telling them how China was able to stem the flow of the virus so quickly through authoritarian measures because of the political regime that's in place there, tracking people through their cell phones and knowing where they went. And using their network of cameras to track where people went. And so they were able to snuff this out, I think, quicker than the free Western world is going to be. And I had some people on my staff say, "Oh, that sounds great." And I'm thinking in my mind, what the fuck are you talking about? That sounds great, right? And so we certainly don't want that to happen here. But, I think we're in the thick of it, right? And, I said I didn't want to get trapped in Toronto. I'm reading people on Twitter like CFR, Council of Foreign Relations people, Pulitzer Prize winners saying, like, you've got 5 days to decide where you want to spend the next 3 months. Go fill your gas cans, etc. I'm looking at the lines at Costco, man. People throwing wine and booze and stuff in the cart.
And I'm talking.
Exactly. And I'm talking to my friend back east that owns a liquor store, and he's saying yesterday was the busiest day he's seen in like 3 generations of owning the liquor store. People pulling 2 carts overflowing. And so, I worry about the rights and the freedom grabs and the overarching government for sure. But I'm just trying to keep myself and my family safe during the heat of it right now, right?
Let's talk about how preventable the next stage is, because the next stage, whether we believe that the media has done its job in hyping it, if you believe that, right, or that government, and it's both sides at this point, right? Even President Trump struck a more somber note here yesterday in his response. But whoever you want to point your finger at, the bottom line is people are dying and more people are going to die and more people are going to be sick. I think that's not something that's up for debate because of how unprepared we were. And so can we speak to the response a bit? And by response, I don't mean just the response by President Trump and his administration. I mean the response by both parties where the immediate reaction is to pump trillions of dollars of money that we don't have, hoping that some of that sticks. What is the end game there, Mickey? What do you see as the end game? I can tell you, and I won't put words in Nick's mouth, but I'll tell you my opinion. There's this great book, The Fourth Turning, that Nick and I often talk about in our Bizarro World podcast, and I believe that we're in the midst of one of those. And so this is something that aligns perfectly with that view, right? Where the old way of thinking, little by little, is done away with because it proves so ineffective. Is this central banks and specifically the Fed's last chance at maintaining any sort of control before a great reset?
Well, I'm concerned with the amount of dollars that will be created out of thin air. You know, there's a bipartisan proposal now to give everybody $1,000 check so they can go out and presumably hoard more bog rolls or whatever they're hoarding at this stage. You know, the amount of debt. I mean, the country's already bankrupt. We know that. And the amount of debt that's going to be generated on top of our, 24 trillion already. And it's going to be wasted money for the most part. Certainly, we weren't prepared for this. I would say that, the optimistic end game for me is that globalism once again is defeated. This is the third time that there's been great enthusiasm worldwide for globalism since the Soviet Union's demise in 1991. And the first time was in 1997, and Thailand's banking system went south, and we had the Asian contagion, and we didn't have globalization. The second bout with globalization was in 06 and 07, and that blew up in 08 with this systemic worldwide banking credit default obligations, or whatever they were called. I'm trying to remember exactly. And globalization went by the wayside again. And this is the third time that globalism will not come about. And in that regard, I'm a patriotic American, and I think the good that will come out of this is more American independence from world, or let's say Chinese influence. We certainly weren't prepared for this. 95% of our medicines now come from China. So I think it will force us to be more nationalistic in our views and more self-sufficient. And I would carry that into the resource sector too, which is what we're all intimately involved in. We need the U.S. to be more independent for its natural resources than it is now.
Two different themes there, Nick. Two really quick, Nick. Two different themes there, because I think it's important to make a distinction. The one was self-sufficiency, which I completely agree with. The other sentiment was to be more nationalistic, which for me is hard to wrap my head around, given how much of our treasury market is owned by the Chinese, right? So just a quick point there, Nick. I didn't mean to cut you off there.
It's a return to community, just like you saw in the World War II era. That's what the fourth turning is. It's the length of a human life, which was typically 80 years, but and so we're right there, right, 1930 to wherever we are now. And so what you see is a bumping away from what we've seen over the past 20 years, and that's a turn toward the government for safety. We just talked about the Patriot Act and the overarching government. We've wanted them to have our back after terrorism and throughout wars, and now you're going to see a reverberation against that, where we take things back into our own hands and handle them in our own communities. And you're seeing that now, where local doctors and state institutions and organizations are saying, you know what, fuck you, feds. You're telling us not to test. We're doing it. We're going to run these samples. We're going to do these tests. We're not waiting for your guidance. We're going to come up with our own test panel. I'm seeing it in Italy, where they're running out of respirator parts in the hospital, and they got local business owners using 3D printers to print the respirator parts. Wow. It's taking it back into your individual's hand and using your community to get through things. And I think that's what we go back to with this virus. And I think the virus also exposes flaws that we've seen in the system. And and the centralized government's inability to respond to those things, especially for the people who need them most. And I think you see a spotlight shown on things that have had a shadow cast on them for years, like the importance of truck drivers and checkout clerks and things like that. So I don't know. I think a lot of things are going to be exposed and shown upon.
How hypocritical have both parties been? And we're going to take the Trump administration to task because they're in charge right now, right? And they're running Congress. But you see the spending. You see, I joked last week the socialism was coming to America, and it wasn't because of Bernie Sanders. It was because of Donald Trump. And now here we are a few days later with trillion-dollar stimulus proposals. And that's face value. You're getting shadow trillion-dollar proposals that are happening via $500 billion repo overnight operations that are now going to be conducted daily for infinity until it blows up. What's the next step, Mickey? What happens next?
Well, I think that's a great fear we all have is we are moving more toward a nanny state, more toward socialism. And you're exactly right. It's a bipartisan effort for the government to continue to, or even more so, exert influence and control over our lives. And that's my real concern. Bottom line would be socialism. There you go, Nick. And it's conjoined twin fascism, and it leads to totalitarianism. And in this country, we have been since the fall, well, let's put it this way. Since 9/11, we've been moving more and more toward that form of government, and that really concerns me.
I agree with that, Mickey. I mean, who knows what comes next? You can't even keep track of the news hour to hour, let alone minute to minute right now.
Yeah.
I was telling my wife, I worked for 2 hours and then I went and turned Bloomberg TV on, and that's when I saw the $1.5 trillion stimulus, $1,000 checks, and I was like, man, I was working with my head down for 2 hours and I missed the stimulus package.
Yeah.
And so you got to stay glued to it. The volatility is so high that some people that have seen 2 or 3 cycles are calling this uninvestable, right? You got the VIX, I think, over 75 at 80.
Yeah.
The volatility of gold, the volatility of oil. I mean, it's moving in extreme direction, both directions, one day to the next. And so, keep dry powder, fund the companies that are going to be able to raise cash and have cash on the other side of this, and sit tight and make a list of what you want to buy when things settle down a little bit, I think.
I get a newsletter, and it's one of the oldest newsletters. It was the 2 sisters who called for $1,000 gold back in 1981, and we never got there. But the Aiden sisters letter came out last night, or a special alert, and at the end of their letter, they said, this is not a time to buy, and this is not a time to sell. And I think that's, except for very specific opportunities, it's a time to sit on the sidelines and let this volatility start to work its way out of the system.
Do you see a future, and I'm hopeful for this, but do you see a future where the U.S., because of the deficit that we're blowing out right now, and we're doing it willingly now, right? We openly, the right, the left, both sides are doing it. Do you see a future where we meddle less in the world, right? I mean, we talked about 9/11, and the one thing we failed to mention is, as horrible as it was for the thousands of soldiers that died, American soldiers, and came back with PTSD and the families that were displaced as a result of military intervention overseas, there were hundreds of thousands and millions of people affected that just, in Warren Buffett's words, didn't win the lottery. They were born in the wrong place. Bottom line, didn't do anything else other than they were born in the wrong place. Do you see a future where we meddle less and focus internally more?
Certainly, I hope so. I'm a pacifist at heart, and I'm older, obviously older than you guys, and I grew up in the Vietnam generation, and if I hadn't had a student deferment for 4 years, I would have been in Vietnam. But that would be part of the good that comes out of this, in my opinion, and that's part of what I'm calling American nationalism. And some people object to that term, but it's time for us to really draw all our world resources back inside our own border and act in the best interest of Americans who live here, in my opinion.
Nick, in such an interconnected world, I mean, can we do that? I think it's reasonable to say we should all be more self-sufficient, whether it's a family, a neighborhood, a city, a state, right? We can focus there. I think that's commendable. But how realistic is with the global economy that we have now to say we want to distance ourselves, and not to put words in Mickey's mouth, but to say we want to distance ourselves and just be America only, because there is a difference between America first and America only, right?
I'm saying America first, okay?
Excellent.
That's my
Perfect.
point. America
Perfect.
first. I'm not saying America only, except we shouldn't be fighting wars in
Absolutely.
third world countries in the Middle East that are fake countries to begin with, cobbled together by the British and French after
Yep.
World War One.
Agreed.
That's where I come from.
Excellent point. No, agreed.
I'd like to see how the new system is quote unquote set up. If we think we're heading to some sort of new Bretton Woods or some sort of new system, I'm interested to see where the petrodollar fits into that. I think you see some of it come to a natural end with the cycles I was talking about, right? You're going to have a 75-year-old white guy as your next president, but after that, you're going to get someone really young. And so I think some of that naturally comes along with that because they have a different set of ideals along with a different generational perspective.
Yeah, it's interesting to me. One last point on my end, that all of the proposals made by, some of the younger, more polarizing figures in our political spectrum, the ideas of like a basic universal income and healthcare for all, where everybody can be tested.
$1,000 for everybody.
Right.
Gerard.
It's the Trump administration that's doing all of it and selling it to the American public. Whether you agree with it or not, I think we should all be honest that this administration has been it's been hypocrisy at its finest. And the left has always been of the belief that there should be this vast social safety net. And again, whether you agree with it or not, I'll argue that the Trump administration has done more to promote the left's version of that than the left. And I think that speaks to how ineffective the left has been in the past 20, 30 years, and why I think Trump wins the presidency again, and we're going to get 4 more years despite this pullback.
And all three of us know what they can't print more of. So regardless of which side the helicopter money is going to come from, right?
Cheers to that, gentlemen. Cheers to that.
At $1,500 an ounce, gentlemen, it looks like a buy to me. So
I've added companies that have the liquidity to see this crisis through. I bought some Midas Gold last week. I've been adding throughout the last couple of months. I'll probably continue to. There's other companies out there. Everything that I like is almost 50 or 60% cheaper than it was.
And it's probably going down even more, Gerardo. So be prepared to average down, my friend.
Absolutely. Like I always say, invest for the cycle, speculate for the cycle. If you're trying to find a bottom, you're not going to get it unless you're...
I think the thing I would say is if you don't already own plenty of gold, you ought to be buying more gold or some gold. Personally, every day that goes by, a higher percentage of my net assets are in gold because everything else is going down so fast. And I'm happy with the amount of gold I own.
Excellent.
That's
Nick?
exactly right. No, that's it. We're all gold owners here. I think we all have a bit of cash, and I think we should, reconvene and have some more cervezas and drinks when we're looking for to harness the upside of what we were just dealt.
Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure. I want to follow this up hopefully in a couple of weeks, see where the markets are, and then let's get specific and talk some stocks here in a couple of weeks. I think people would enjoy that.
That was great. Stay safe, gents.
Likewise.
Cheers, gentlemen.